In this lecture, we'll look more at the sort of specific fundamentals within bioethics itself. In this lecture, we'll talk about two different topics. So the first one will be different types of principles or duties. And then the second, more lengthier part of this lecture will cover the main principles in bioethics. I put 5 in scare quotes here because utility isn't really considered one of the main principles in bioethics. Vaughan just sort of has it added to the list. Really, autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice are the main principles in bioethics, as we'll see from the Beecham and Childress readings. So here in this lecture, we'll just talk about them superficially, since we're going to spend so much time on them in the future, just so you have a basic understanding of what those principles mean. So let's begin by differentiating an absolute principle from a prima facie principle. The title of this slide is "Do I Have to?" And that's what you should be thinking about when we're trying to distinguish these two different types of principles. So an absolute principle is one that always applies. There are no exceptions. You're always obligated to follow through. A prima facie principle is that you're obligated to follow through on the action unless there is some exception that warrants your inaction in a certain circumstance. And so a good example of this would be Batman. So if you don't know, Batman has one rule, which is he doesn't kill. So for Batman, it's an absolute principle or an absolute duty to never kill. But you might then consider that there might be some situations in which killing is okay. Not that I'm trying to convince you to go out and become a murderer or anything like that, but the idea is that, well, imagine in cases of like war, or in cases in which somebody is going to cause serious harm to a lot of other people and there's no other way to stop them from doing it. Maybe it's a prima facie principle to not kill. The reason why I want to bring up this distinction, this is not necessarily a bioethics specific distinction. This distinction between prima facie principles and absolute principles appear in other areas of especially applied ethics. But you'll see the term prima facie obligation throughout our different readings this semester. So it's important to know what's being meant by that. Let's look at the main principles in bioethics. Let's begin with autonomy. Autonomy is used to refer to a person's rational capacity for self-governance or self-determination, meaning that they're able to make decisions for themselves. If you're interested in the Greek etymology for the term, I don't know why you would be, but in case of you are, autos means self, nomos means law, so that's where we get the idea of self-governance. To give you an example, I really enjoy ices. So if I want to go to a convenience store and purchase an icy, I have the autonomy to go there and purchase one. Nobody is allowed to stop me from doing it because I can make my own decisions for myself. That is what we mean by autonomy, that you have the ability to weigh considerations and then make a decision based on that, and nothing impedes your ability to enact that decision. But we might ask ourselves, can somebody really act autonomously without being informed? So imagine that I just drink ices like I'm drinking water, and somebody says, well, Colby, that's not healthy, that's going to cause a number of different problems for you. And I'm like, oh, I don't believe that. I can drink as much as I want. And then somebody might start presenting evidence to me or facts and suggest, well, you might not be making the best decision for yourself or something like that. And so insofar as we have autonomous decision-making capacity, we also have to consider that there's an informed aspect to this, and which we'll talk about later. In bioethics, one of the key concepts is informed consent. And so we'll question whether or not any decision can be autonomous unless it's informed first. Another idea that gets raised by Vaughan here is the harm principle, which is to say, this is from Mill. We don't necessarily have to believe this as fact. This is just what Mill said. Again, philosophy, it's great. You make the decisions for yourself as long as you can give a good reasoned argument for why to accept or reject a principle. But here, the harm principle just refers to someone's autonomy might be rightfully impeded if it is done so to prevent harm to others. So the whole idea is that your autonomy should be limitless unless your autonomy is ultimately going to infringe on somebody else's autonomy and cause them harm. Then the other big concept that we'll talk about when it comes to autonomy and especially beneficence when we get to Beecham and Childress's chapter is the idea of paternalism. So we'll spend quite a bit of time. We'll even spend a week in the second half of the semester talking about paternalism. Paternalism is just overriding a person's actions or decision making for the person's own good. So when you hear the term paternalism, you should think of something like a parent. A parent can tell a kid no if they want to buy an icy. Why? Because they know that it's not good for them, and so they override the kid's autonomous decision to get an icy. That would be the idea here. Then we can have a distinction between different types of paternalism, which we'll talk more about later in the semester, but just for a good first run on this, which is that weak paternalism is when we are overriding a person's decisions or actions because they lack a certain rational capacity. So this would be for kids. So parents might be permitted to infringe on a kid's autonomy because the child lacks a certain rational capacity to make decisions for themselves. And then there's strong paternalism, which is when a person still possesses that rational capacity and yet their decisions are suppressed. So in my case of an icy, if somebody sort of starts knocking ices out of my hands, so then I can't ever have another one because they say it's not good for me, that would be a case of strong paternalism. The second principle is non-maleficence, and non-maleficence, you can break down the word non meaning no, maleficence meaning harm or ill will, right? So non-maleficence just refers to the responsibility to not inflict harm onto others, either intentionally or unintentionally. If you're familiar with the Hippocratic Oath, which is sort of the standard by which the healthcare field has sort of held itself up to for the longest time, it's the idea of first do no harm. And so we'll talk about this pretty at length, and if you ever see the term non-maleficence, just think you have a responsibility to not harm another person. The third principle is beneficence, and it sounds quite similar to non-maleficence, but we'll talk about it here in a second, why they're different and why we have two separate principles for them. But so beneficence is just used to refer to the responsibility to actively promote the well-being of others and prevent or remove any harm from them. So a couple examples here. If your neighbor asks for a ride to work, beneficence would be giving that neighbor a ride to work or donating food to a food bank. So what makes this different than non-maleficence is the fact that here, for beneficence, we have a positive duty. We're obligated to do something on behalf of another person, whereas non-maleficence is what we call a negative duty. We're obligated to not do something to somebody. So not cause harm, not inflict pain. Those are all consistent with the principle of non-maleficence, whereas providing medication or providing a wellness check or providing physical therapy, those are all acts that are consistent with the principle of beneficence. So that's a key difference between non-maleficence and beneficence. Finally, we have the principle of justice. And generally speaking, justice can be defined as people getting what is fair or what is their due, what are they owed, right? It's very complicated, and we can get more specific with that definition. People have been talking about this for over 2,500 years, what counts as justice. So just take this as a working definition to get into the more elaborate conversations later. So we have different types of justice. So retributive or punitive justice is the fair meting out of punishment for wrongdoing. This would be like receiving a sentence for committing X crime, right? You were sentenced for 5 years as punishment. You're sentenced to 25 years for punishment for this, right? So that's retributive or punitive justice. But you also have distributive justice, which is the one that we'll probably be talking about the most within the bioethics field, which is the fair distribution of advantages and disadvantages. The idea is that however these goods are distributed, it should be distributed in a fair way. Finally, you have restorative and restitutive justice, which is repairing the harms caused by a wrongdoing. And so this can be situations in which somebody receives payment or somebody receives a replacement for something that was damaged or broken. That would be restitutive or restorative justice. But like I said, we're going to be focusing on distributive justice throughout the semester. The other two I just wanted you to be familiar with. Finally, we have a number of different theories of justice. Libertarian, egalitarian, utilitarian, communitarian. We'll also add to the list recent theories of justice, like the capabilities theory and the well-being theory. But we'll hold off on that for now, because once we get to the Beecham and Childress chapter, we'll really discuss what those mean, what they mean within the bioethics field, and things like that. But for now, it's just important to know that justice is one of the key principles within bioethics, and it's just about fair treatment or receiving what one is owed. Real quick. So we started off by differentiating an absolute duty from a prima facie duty. An absolute duty is one that we have to fulfill no matter what. There are no exceptions. Prima facie duty is a duty in which we are expected to uphold a certain standard, but there are some situations where exceptions are permitted. We have to argue for why those exceptions are morally permissible. The reason why I really wanted to flag this distinction is because you'll see prima facie pop up throughout the semester in different readings. So when you see prima facie duty, think, yes, you are obligated to uphold a certain norm or a certain practice, but there might be some situations in which that is softened to permit a sort of action that is inconsistent with that duty. Then we talked about the core principles that inform bioethics. We spent time on autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. We skipped utility because, as we'll see with Beecham and Childress, they sort of incorporate utility throughout the different chapters. But we just touched on them briefly. We'll spend quite a bit of time on those 4 principles moving forward.